Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. I recently had some inspiration for a cool Warhammer 40k diorama idea featuring Squigs and Acadian Shock Trooper, so in this video, I'm going to build it. Next week, there'll be a second part where I paint the diorama, but I wanted to split this project into 2 videos so that I can take a bit more time to make something epic. To achieve my idea, I knew I'd have to do a little bit of shopping. So the first thing I made sure I bought was 5 different Squigs. 3 of the Squigs were from Warhammer 40k, they're part of the kill teams for orcs, and they're covered in all kind of nasty things that blow up. To boost my numbers of Squigs, I decided to buy 2 different Squigs from the Squig Herd pack from Age of Sigmar. And I chose 2 Squigs that had dynamic poses and weren't covered in too many mushrooms. I bought these Squigs as singles on eBay so that I didn't have to fork out all the money for a whole pack. To bring this diorama to life, I also wanted to pick up 2 other things, and that was a pack of Acadian Shock Troopers and the Acadian Shock Trooper upgrade screw. For this diorama, I'll only be needing a few pieces from the upgrade screw and 1 of the bodies of the Acadians, but I wanted to pick up the whole set because I know that I'm going to need and use more Acadians in the future for various videos and stuff, so it's not going to be a waste. And with the Squig parts and the Acadian parts in hand, the last thing I really needed to think about was the base of this diorama. When I look at all these amazing dioramas online, they always have these big, chunky, awesome plinth bases, and I didn't want to spend the money on getting a big one of those, but I wanted something a little bit bigger than this 100mm base that you can see in front of you. So, luckily, I know someone who loves woodworking, and they turned for me on their lathe this basic block of wood that is 120mm in diameter. And this should make the perfect base for this diorama. So with my 5 kind of adorable, kind of horrific Squigs, I began by removing all their mold lines. I gave them a quick scrape until all the mold lines had disappeared, and that meant the Squigs were ready for gluing, so now it was time to move on to the Acadian parts that I needed. I have done quite a lot of planning for this diorama, so I pretty much know the parts that I want. And the first of those is this injured and bandaged head. Then the next part that I want is this bandaged arm. And then I found the body that I wanted from the main Shock Trooper pack, and I wanted this one that's leaning forward, looking like he's running. So I located those parts on the sprue, and then I cut them out. On the upgrade sprue, there were also a few other little bits I wanted to use, like this fuel canister, and also this right arm carrying an axe. Then it was the Acadian parts' turn to be scraped. Then, with the mold lines gone, it's time to glue together the 2 upper body parts with the 2 leg parts. I'm not going to glue the head and arms on at this stage, I'm just going to use the body as a reference so I can plan where everything will go on the diorama. And while I had the glue at the ready, I thought I might as well glue together the Squigs at this point as well. For 2 of the Squigs, I decided to leave their mouthpieces off of their faces, as when it comes time to paint them, it will be easier to paint inside their mouths and on their faces if their big lower jaws are not in the way. So the idea and inspiration behind this diorama is for me to make a Squig chase scene. I imagined a Acadian trooper just having the worst day. Let's say he was out with his squad on patrol, and they run into a whole herd of Squigs and orcs. There's a big battle, and everything starts to go south, and this guy's whole squad gets wiped out. As the last remaining survivor, and with no one to shoot him for desertion, this guy decides to run for his life. So the orcs pack a load of their Squigs with explosives and send them to chase this guy to his doom. And that's really the moment I wanted to capture with this diorama. This Acadian having a terrible day, he's got no weapons left, he is injured and hurt, and he is just running for his life from these horrific Squigs. Now I wanted to turn my attention to the actual base of the diorama and what that was going to look like. As I bought new models for the Acadians and the Squigs, I didn't want to spend any money on new terrain parts, so I just wanted to work with what I already had. What I have from previous videos is cork sheet, some medium-sized bark chunks, and milliput, and a few little stones and chip texture things that I can spread around the base. I initially tore random chunks of cork off of these sheets that I had from other projects, and I just began placing them on the base, roughly where I thought they should go, and then layering them up with different layers to create some height. Because my diorama is going to be a chase scene, I wanted my Squigs to be on different elevations so that it was more interesting than just all 5 on the ground. I had a plan to have this channel down the middle that was at ground level and then to raise up 2 sides next to it. The first bits I was using to plan things out were just rough, so I needed to make some proper tailored to fit pieces here. So that's what I was doing. I was making something that would match the curve of the base and trying to then make layers that would all work with each other. These layers were bigger and stepped more gently and were generally just better for this base, and I had tailored them to fit the space. So when I had them finished and ready for their initial sort of round, I had something that looked like this. And for an extra element of detail here, I added these wooden planks to the front, and this will just help make the front of the diorama look more interesting. In terms of the lore for this diorama, these planks can be part of an established path that these squads use, or perhaps he's running back to a camp. The cork sheets that I'm using were just to build up the structure of the terrain, but I really need to add detail to it, and so to do that I'm going to use bark and slate, and I'm going to layer those over the top of the cork to create the texture that I need. This whole thing is going to get a layer of texture paste over the top, and it would be totally fine to just add the texture paste straight on the cork, but for me, I want to go for a particular type of rock look, so I'm going to be adding the texture paste just between the rocks, just covering all the cork sheets. To really sell the look I'm going for, I can't just stick the bark to the top of the cork all over the place. It would be too contrasting in height. So I decided to cut into the cork to create areas that I could then embed the bark pieces into. And this means that the recesses between my textured areas wouldn't be so deep, and therefore I won't have to fill them with as much texture paste, and also they'll look more natural. It dawned on me at this point that it would be quite difficult to cut into the cork but also keep it in the same place without gluing it, and I didn't want to commit to gluing it yet just in case I didn't like what I was doing. So I came up with a little tactic that I could use to help keep the cork in place while I was working on cutting out all the bits for the cork. And it was basically to stick bits of paperclip into the cork and then glue them to the bottom layer only. By doing this, I would allow myself to still be able to lift the top layers off of the structure, but by having two paper clips, it would keep all of the cork sheets in the same place so I could cut them out equally for the cork. And it was essential to have two because I needed to make sure the layers wouldn't spin. And that worked surprisingly well for me, so from there I then worked on carving into the top layers of the cork so that I could add more bark to texture up those areas to look more like rocks. And then you can start to see how that progressed so that I was adding more bark into the layers above. With a few of the layers done, I got confident enough to glue the first bit into place. And yeah, I did use pencil lines to roughly see where I was going to stick things. Then I could glue the bark pieces into the cutout shapes that I'd made for them. And then it was really just a case of building up the layers and the extra bits of cork until I had a complete structure that I was happy with. And now hopefully you can see that this piece of terrain now has so much texture, and it's natural looking texture because of this bark. And when we cover the bits of cork in between with texture paste, everything will look really cool. And then I basically had to do the same thing with the other bit of terrain that I had planned. This piece was much smaller and needed much less bark to cover it, so it was much quicker to do. But no less fun to work on, and in the end I had another nice little piece of terrain that looked just as textured as the first one. I think the randomness of the bark really helps when creating natural stuff, because then you don't have to think about it, it's already kind of random. The backsides of these lumps of terrains were still a bit rough, and you could still see the different layers of the cork sheets, so I went in with some pliers and a knife, and I basically just cleaned those up so that they looked a bit more natural and the layers were a little bit less visible. Now you can see here in this clip that I had made a huge mess playing with all that cork, so I had to take a second to clean my hobby desk. And with that out the way, we can finally take a really good look at what I have so far. And I've even stuck one of the squigs in place with some blue tack, just for now, just to show roughly where I was thinking that he would go, and to show what I meant by that channel in the middle. Before I can whip out the texture paste, there's one last step I need to do, and that is to grab some milliput and fill in the deepest gaps between these bark pieces. I've learned from experience that if you try and use texture paste on really deep areas, it can sometimes sink inwards as it dries, leaving you with a weird hole. To combat that, I'm going to use milliput as a structure underneath to help me and to make it so I can use less texture paste while I'm filling in these gaps. So I basically just squidged the milliput into the gaps using a sculpting tool, working around the whole model between all the biggest gaps in the bark until I had something that looked like this. I didn't worry about covering every inch of cork because I know that I'm going to be adding a texture paste. I had also forgotten about the bottom part of the back of the diorama, so I had to go back there and I had to carve and work at the cork until I had a slope going up to the bark areas that I was happy with. One extra bit of detail I just thought about doing before adding the texture paste is to mess up these wooden planks a bit. In the 40k world, these planks would not be pristine, so I had to break them and score texture into them and make them look a bit more random. Carving texture into the wood would help me when it comes to paint because then I'd have some deep recess areas where my shade paints can collect. And hopefully in this clip you can just about see the texture I've been scratching into the pieces. And then to try and get as good a look as possible on the sides and keep them from getting any texture paste on them, I decided to cover the rim of the diorama base with some tape. Now, I don't recommend using double-sided tape like I used. I was being lazy, definitely use masking tape instead. It didn't really do any damage, but it was a bit of a pain to get off. And then it was time for texture paste. So texture paste goes all over the flat part of the model. I kept it kind of thin. I didn't want this to look like a really deep muddy bog. This is actually not going to be mud. Well, it is going to be mud and soil and earth, but it's not going to be like a dirty muddy field. It's more like a desert. And while the texture paste was still setting, I made sure to add my wooden planks in. My initial thoughts for this diorama was something like a jungle or a woodland floor, but I don't really have the materials needed to do a convincing version of that. So I did a load of research online and I found a place that I think looks really cool and that I could probably recreate with the things that I have. And that place was Zion National Park in the United States. I've never been, but I googled pictures and it has this great contrast of green vegetation with orangey brown soil and mud and rocks. So like a desert, but with green kind of normal vegetation. I think I found pictures from a particular place called Timber Creek Overlook, which has these really nice examples if you want to Google it and see for yourself. That's what I'm going to try and go for. If the painting changes a bit, well, we can just pretend it's a different planet in Warhammer 40k, and therefore that's why it will look a bit different. I mean, technically, when you're making up a diorama, it can be on any planet, and there can be an infinite number of planets, and the planets can be anything you want them to be. So technically, any terrain I make can be canon for this diorama. Hopefully, you've seen in the background here that I'm adding texture paste all over the cork to try and hide it so that we don't have any cork texture visible. I even did that around the back, and you can see that here. Going to make that look way more natural when it all dries. Then it was just a case of finishing the other little piece of terrain on the diorama and making sure that that looked like there was no cork visible as well. I heaped on a little bit more texture paste just in the little valley region between the two bits of terrain to ensure that there was a nice smooth gradient and it looked like the earth was sort of joining down towards the ground. I didn't want the ground of the diorama to look too samey, so I did try and add some other texture pastes to this for some crackly effects. As this is going to be a kind of desert-like environment, I thought that it would be good to add some crackly paints like a Grellan Badland and a Grellan Earth. I was cautious and I only added them in fairly small parts over certain areas of the model just to give a tiny bit of texture and extra detail. Oh look, and here's me removing the double-sided tape, which was super easy and barely an inconvenience. Didn't cause me any trouble at all. So with all those texture pastes dry, this is what I had, and you can start to see the crackling was appearing there. But now I'm going to dip into my Battlefield Trophies box and start pulling out some skulls. I don't want to go over the top with the skulls, but I do want a few littered around the base. So I'm mainly going to go for an Orc skull and a couple of Cadian helmets and stick those around. I did also pick a normal human skull that I stuck at the back. I trialed out where I wanted them to go, and then when I was happy, I added my glue and stuck them into place. For a tiny extra touch, I scattered about a whole load of little chips of rockiness, and then I just added those all over the place in order to create even more texture. At this point, that's pretty much all the work on the main diorama base, so now I need to turn my attention back to the Squigs and the Cadian and finish them up. I thought it would be funny if one of the Squigs just didn't have any explosives on them, like no one had bothered or cared to put it on that one, but for the other Squig that was from the Age of Sigmar, I needed to add some Warhammer 40k bits. So I settled on choosing to add a fuel tank and some orc grenades to one of the Squigs. I didn't want to just stick them on randomly as if they're pierced into his skin, so I decided to sculpt a tiny little strap out of milliput that I would use to stick between, and it's kind of like saddlebags in that it's been draped over this squig. It was kind of tricky to use milliput to do this, and what I ended up doing was just sticking a whole wad of it to the top of his head and then using my knife to just cut nice neat lines of it away and then push them away from the sides till I had what was essentially just a little strap. I then glued the fuel tank to the side of the squig and the orc grenades to the other side, and then he's ready to go back to the rest of the herd, joining them as a small ball of destruction. There are only 2 changes I wanted to make to the other Age of Sigmar squid, and the changes to that squig were to cut the mushrooms away and also to stick a Cadian knife sticking out of his head. I love the idea that during the fighting, this Cadian is fighting with this squig and he manages to pull out a knife and like stab the squig. That also means for this diorama that the squig is kind of like especially aggressive and chasing him, which is why it's the one down the middle. So finally, I had to glue together my Cadian guy and I put on the bandaged injured head, the bandaged injured arm, and then I gave him an axe arm just because I love the idea that he's kind of like the final person in a horror movie. If he's been running all day through this environment away from squigs, he's lost all of his bullets, and now all he's got left is a little axe, which isn't going to help him very much because everything that is chasing him is covered in explosives. Before doing the final setup and priming, I wanted to give a close look at some of the areas where I've added some of that texture paste and other details, so you can see that there's lots of detail and texture on this base. I think the texture is going to be key to making this look good. So now I'm going to use blue tack to just loosely put in place all of the models. This is so that when I paint the models, I can still pull them off the base and paint all the way around them. And now for the first time, hopefully you'll get a really good idea of what I'm trying to do with this diorama. I've built this diorama so that it looks okay, hopefully from all angles, but the main viewing angle is here from the front. And when you look at the front like this, hopefully you can just see that the guy is being chased by these 5 squigs and it looks like a nightmare and something terrible is about to happen. It's not a particularly complicated scene, there aren't loads of big explosions or anything, but I do just like the way that it tells a cool story. So now I'm going to prime this up and show you what it looks like when it's all one color. I chose to spray some light grey onto this just to show my direction of light so that when I paint all of the models individually, I can easily see where to put my highlights. I did kind of run out of black primer, so some of the edges around the base and some of the very deepest parts didn't get some primer, but I'll just go in with a brush and add some black primer to those very small parts and it won't make a difference. Otherwise, I'm really excited to paint this next week for the next video. So if you are excited to see me paint this, then please subscribe to the channel and tune into next week's video where I'm going to try really hard to make sure that this is one of the best things I've ever painted.